right, Jason, first thing I need you to do for me, please, state your name, spell it, also give me the title of your book.
Jason P. Theriot, Theriot. Title of the book is American Energy, Imperiled Coast, Oil and Gas Development in Louisiana's Wetlands. The book is essentially a history of the relationship between energy development, oil and gas development, and environmental change. So on one hand, you have energy development, oil and gas development along the coast of Louisiana. Since the 1930s, this has been a working energy coast, primarily for oil and gas exploration and production. And that energy feeds American consumption for oil and gas from the Gulf of Mexico. On the other hand, you have this imperiled coast, this sinking coastline that's been eroding and sinking into the Gulf of Mexico over the last 100 years. So essentially the story is integrating not only energy development but also environmental change and looking at the tension between oil and gas activities and restoration, protecting the coast of Louisiana, bridging those two together. So in the 1920s and early 1930s, when the industry moved into South Louisiana in a scenery similar to this, they came here in search of salt domes. There were prominent salt domes, some that were over 100 feet above natural sea level, like Weeks Island and Avery Island and Cote Blanche Island, which are in the area not too far from here. These were large prominent salt domes where early geologists had discovered pools of petroleum within the areas of these salt domes. In fact, Spindletop, the largest discovery in the Gulf Coast in 1901 in Beaumont, really proved the fact that salt domes created these geological conditions, such as creating sediment traps and these underlying subsurface faults where oil and gas would pool over time. When the oilmen moved into coastal Louisiana in the late 1920s and 1930s, they found many of these salt domes, but most of the big pools were actually on the fringes, several miles out in diameter in the low-lying marshes. So the primary system for building canals, you have what they call location canals or access canals, and you have, of course, pipeline canals. The access canals were used primarily to get access to the areas, to the fringe areas in the marsh around the salt domes to explore for and produce oil and gas from the marsh areas. In these marsh areas, very similar to where we are, there's very few roads. So in order to get access, the industry had to adapt. And in South Louisiana, that meant dredging canals to use barge equipment to move equipment and men and material into these areas to start drilling. So a location canal could be half of a mile of a dug out canal, and at the end would be a keyway where a drill barge would be sunk in place to drill a well. There's thousands of access canals and location canals spread across coastal Louisiana. Then there are the pipeline canals. The major pipelines were built after World War II, beginning in the 1950s. And the pipeline companies utilized the same technology from the 1930s and 40s, which was to dredge these long linear canals in order to bring in these very heavy-duty pipe-lay barges. On dry land operations, when you're laying a pipeline, you use land-based equipment. But out in the marsh, in the coastal wetlands, in the shallow bays and the swamps, it required canals. Okay. So you had small diameter pipelines, 10-inch in diameter, 12-inch, 16-inch. But in order to lay these massive natural gas pipelines, these interstate natural gas pipelines that were built in the 1950s, required some pretty heavy-duty equipment. A large pipe lay barge required a flotation canal. 10-foot deep by 40-foot wide was the typical typical pipeline canal dredged operation. In order to accommodate these big heavy machinery to come through, the spoil was simply placed on the bank, and those canals remained basically open, meaning not backfilled, beginning in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which is when most of these big natural gas pipeline systems were built. However, in the early days, some of the landowners did complain about the intrusion of salt water from the Gulf into these low-lying marsh areas. And so the industry, in order to adapt, they began putting in these plugs or these bulkheads periodically through the canal system. So if you fly over in a little airplane and you see these plugs interspersed amongst this maze of canals, that's what those are. Those are to prevent saltwater intrusion into the marsh. But that was 50, 60 years ago. The trembling prairies is basically the delta marshland, where a man would sink underneath his own weight. So imagine bringing in these huge, heavy drilling equipment into a very fragile marsh ecosystem. So this is very difficult. So they had to adapt. They had to develop new innovations, new ideas, required an entire fleet of marine boats, which is where the Cajun people took off.
You know, it's staggering to me, Jason, to see some of these old pictures, and these guys are literally walking through this, and they're waist deep carrying the equipment over their head.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact of, like, they just seemed, they were just, you know, that, I mean, they were hell-bent that they were going to conquer it, you know?
And many of the oil men who first moved in here, the pipeline engineers, the drilling crews, these were guys from Texas and Oklahoma who had never seen a marsh, had never, for the most part, met Cajun people. So it was a big change for them. Yeah. The coming of the Texas oil men into these bayou communities was a big shock for Louisiana, particularly for the local Cajuns who had been settled in these small bayou communities for 4 or 5 generations. Just the sights of these big, massive drill barges coming into their local bayous and waterways was a shock. The cultural clash between the Cajuns of South Louisiana and the big Texas oil men is a part of the story as well. And the clash had to be worked out over time, this cultural clash, this socioeconomic differences between people from Texas and Oklahoma who had been in the East Texas oil fields in the 20s and 30s, bringing that same brandish attitude down to South Louisiana, concerned a lot of the local people. There was a lot of gambling, there was a lot of alcohol, there was a lot of drinking, there was a lot of activities that was not part of the Cajun way of life. Once the Texas oil men moved out into the marshes and the shallow bays of coastal Louisiana, they required boats, a fleet of boats, and they required people to operate boats. And that's where the Cajun people came into play. They grew up on boats. They had been operating boats all of their lives, and they became an integral part of this oil and gas development history. In the early period, the Cajuns felt as if they had been invaded by the Texas oil men. That attitude began to change. The oil offered tremendous high-paying jobs and careers for many people, perhaps as many as tens of thousands of Cajun people and people of South Louisiana for 2 or 3 generations now. So it's the jobs, it's the high-quality jobs, it's the high-paying jobs and these careers that really began to create a sense of loyalty amongst the people of Louisiana with respect to the oil and gas business.
What is Loop?
Louisiana Offshore Oil Port. So,
and what did the creation of Loop mean for Louisiana?
Yeah. Loop was a big, big deal. Loop is the nation's only offshore oil port. It was built in the 1970s, and it was the first project in the Gulf of Mexico that actually combined environmental scientists with engineering mentality to build an environmentally sensitive pipeline project and an offshore oil transportation project.
But it's also, I mean, you know, there's a line in your book about it would become the leading intermodal marine transportation center, serving approximately 75% of all deep water.
That would be Port Fourchon. So Loop, the Louisiana Offshore Oil Port, was Governor Edwards' pet project in the 1970s. It was a big deal. In fact, it became the nation's first and only offshore oil port. It's about 22 miles south of Lafourche Parish. There's a 75-mile pipeline that transports oil from offshore into southern Louisiana, into these salt dome caverns where the oil is then dispersed into the web of pipelines that feed the nation's refining capacity. But Loop was also important for a number of other reasons. It was the first time where engineers, petroleum engineers, and environmental scientists collaborated to build a sophisticated pipeline in coastal Louisiana in the 1970s for the purpose of limiting environmental impacts. By the 1970s, scientists began producing volume of studies where they began showing that wetlands, coastal marshes, and estuaries were valuable food producers for all the various marine life that existed along the coast and in the offshore waters. So by the 1970s, it became obvious to many that wetlands were a valuable landscape. And in fact, many scientific reports began analyzing the actual monetary value and the productive value that wetlands provide for the public, whether it be as the main food chain for the estuaries, or for storm protection, or for the wintering grounds for migratory birds. And so by the 1970s, with the design and construction of the loop system, those values were taken into account. Coastal restoration and protection has become a top priority for the state of Louisiana, going back to the 1990s now. It is a seminal issue for policymakers, for state leaders, for decision makers, for landowners. It is a big, big deal. And I think the multi-millions of dollars, the windfall of restoration funds that are now flowing to the state from various sources, whether it be from the federal government or from offshore revenue sharing, and the wetland trust funds, the wetland restoration trust funds that were in place by the Louisiana legislature, I think speaks volumes to the state's concern for the coast and for its top priority in investing in infrastructure to improve the coastal systems.